Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Mouin's Weekly Review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. How are you doing, Mouin? Thank you for joining us again.
Hi, Nassim. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise. Um, so we've got a lot to get through today. We'll begin with reports that Israel using banned weapons in Gaza, and these weapons are vaporizing bodies. I've seen a footage of that; it's quite horrific. So we will discuss, what's happening in Gaza and provide the latest updates from the past week. Israel's former Israeli defense minister, Yalon, he himself confirmed that Israel is committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. And to add to that, he said Israel is covering all that up. And that's quite a shocking admission coming from an Israeli former defense minister. We'll discuss reconstruction costs in Gaza, and then some of the latest developments from the region, in particular, situation in Syria and the ceasefire agreement, which Israel reportedly is already in breach of with Lebanon, and some of the fallout from the ICC issuing arrest warrants last week. We've seen response from a number of countries. I want to get your thoughts on France, UK, and other countries who are looking for ways to provide immunity to Netanyahu. So, surprise, surprise. But let's begin with an update on Gaza. As I mentioned, Israel is reportedly using internationally banned weapons. And there are testimonies that some of these bodies are actually not. I've seen videos of these bodies actually vaporizing, and add to that, you have, as I mentioned, former Israeli minister saying that Israel is committing crimes against humanity and is carrying out ethnic cleansing in Gaza. So just get your thoughts on that first of all.
Thank you, Nassim. Well, to take the first question first about Israel's apparent use of new and heretofore unknown weapons in what can only be described as a war of annihilation, a war of extermination against anything and everything that moves in the northern Gaza Strip, including direct attacks on hospitals, on hospital wards, the killing of young children who are moving about the street in desperate search for food or water. Of course, Israel is not going to provide any information on what weapons it's using. But as you know, videos have been circulating showing, for example, horrific images of rapid amounts of steam just jetting out, what appears to be steam just jetting out of the upper body of a casualty. And Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have reported that in a number of cases, the corpses of those killed in Israeli raids have simply vaporized and not to be found. I think it's quite clear that in addition to the war of annihilation, the Gaza Strip is now also serving as a human laboratory, as a testing ground for new Israeli weapons, which will then be marketed around the world as tested and proven in actual battle scenarios. So, for example, the Israeli analyst Jeff Halper, a number of years ago, published an important book, War Against the People, in which he explains Israel's use of the occupied territories as a human laboratory, as a human testing ground for new weapon systems, for new security systems, as a key component of the explanation of why Western countries and a number of others support Israel and its occupation despite its crimes. And he basically concludes, well, they support Israel because of its crimes, because it gives them access to, let's call them for the sake of argument, battle tested weapons, which they can then themselves deploy against their own adversaries and enemies. And the Australian author Anthony Lowenstein has more recently written a book making broadly similar argument. So that's, I think, perhaps one more point about northern Gaza. By all accounts, this really is the most intensive campaign of annihilation and extermination since October of last year. Many on the ground reporters and others who have been closely observing the Gaza Strip for well over the past year have come to the conclusion or have observed that we've seen nothing like this really since October 7th of last year. It's really on an altogether different and more intensive scale. And that I think reflects two factors. The first one is the repeated Israeli statements of intent to eliminate all Palestinian human life from the northern Gaza Strip in order to permanently control it, eventually to annex it, and increasingly, according to Israeli statements, to establish illegal settlements in the northern Gaza Strip as well. And it seems, by all accounts, that Israel intent is of establishing an indefinite, long-term, illegal, of course, physical occupation of the northern Gaza Strip. The other factor, which is less clear, but we also need to incorporate into our calculations, is the upcoming Trump presidency in the United States, which begins in January of next year. And against the background of various reports that Trump has informed the Israeli government and its prime minister, the international fugitive Benjamin Netanyahu, that he wants Israel's campaign to come to a conclusion before Trump assumes office on the 20th of January 2025, so that he can successfully present himself as a anti-war candidate, as someone who brings wars to an end rather than as someone who amplifies and intensifies them. That's more speculative, but that may well figure into what we're seeing as well. So
So that would assume, sorry, so just to
yes,
interrupt, that would
please.
assume that Biden's kind of washed his hand of Gaza and is not really seeking any kind of ceasefire or thinking to push the needle along. I mean, he's not really doing anything, and is just resigned to the fact that it's beyond his capacity to make any change, any impact on Gaza, and is leaving the arena to a Trump administration.
Well, if Biden were washing his hands of this question, it would be a huge improvement because, in fact, the Biden administration remains very deeply involved, exceeding even complicity, but active participation in Israel's genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip. As you know, it supplies all the weapons, it supplies all the diplomatic support. There are numerous reports of direct intelligence cooperation, of U.S. assistance to Israel in identification of targets and so on, not only in the Gaza Strip, but of course also in Lebanon and for example in Yemen. So I think we have long passed the stage where we can only speak about an Israeli campaign in the Gaza Strip, but we have to be accurate. We now have to speak about the U.S. armed and U.S. supplied and U.S. supported Israeli genocidal war against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. There are, of course, some reports in recent days of renewed ceasefire negotiations in Cairo, this time being led primarily by the Egyptians and the new head of its General Intelligence Directorate. And those appear to be focusing on two issues. The first is the contours of an Israeli-Palestinian ceasefire agreement in the Gaza Strip, which would entail a cessation of hostilities, a withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip, and an exchange of captives. And as you suggested, that's unlikely to go anywhere because the Israeli government remains more or less dead set against such an agreement. And we're not going to see any pushback from the Biden administration about, for example, using its leverage with Israel to compel Israel to accept what, according to Washington, is an Israeli ceasefire proposal. So that seems off the cards unless Netanyahu begins to feel the heat more seriously from the incoming Trump administration, which, as I suggested, is an open question. And the second aspect of those negotiations is that Egypt is also hosting discussions between Hamas and, on the one hand, and the Fatah movement, let's call it the Palestinian Authority, on the other, to seek to forge agreement between them on the post-war administration of the Gaza Strip. And there, significant progress appears to have been made between these two movements. But again, this is all essentially just discussion and agreement that cannot be implemented unless there is also a framework agreement between Israel and the Palestinians to end the genocidal war in the Gaza Strip. So that's the first part of your question. For the second one, and what you mentioned about the former Israeli, the
Yeah,
former,
Moshe Yalon.
yes, Moshe
Defense.
Yaalon, former Israeli chief of staff, and I believe he was also defense minister
That's
at
right.
one point, and was defense minister during, or I believe he was the head of the Air Force during the Second Intifada, and then defense minister during Israel's first onslaught on the Gaza Strip in 2008, 2009, if I'm not mistaken. But he has very clearly and explicitly accused Israel of perpetrating war crimes in the Gaza Strip, of being engaged in a campaign of ethnic cleansing in the Gaza Strip. And when challenged on those statements, he has, if anything, doubled down and insisted on once again emphasizing his assessment of what Israel is doing. Now, on the face of it, this seems rather strange because Yaron is also someone who, when asked what he feels when Israel bombs a building that kills 25 civilians in search of a single Hamas military leader, this was during the Second Intifada, he said, well, what I feel is that the wing of the plane moves slightly. So this is clearly someone who is at best as amoral as the rest of them. But there are two important background factors here, which I think help explain his recent statement. The first is, of course, developments at the International Criminal Court. And so we're beginning to see people who bear direct responsibility for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, for crimes of aggression, for the crime of genocide against the Palestinian people, to begin to kind of try to separate themselves from the system and structure and policies in which they are themselves deeply implicated. And I wouldn't underestimate, in this respect, the impact that the first ICC indictments of Israeli leaders may have, if not on the conduct, then at least on the public statements, particularly of those who are no longer in office, let's say. The second one I think that helps explain this is that with Netanyahu's recent firing of Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who of course is now also an international fugitive from justice, and replacing him with Ephraim Katz, someone who has absolutely no background in the security sector or Israel's military. The military establishment has lost its voice around the Israeli cabinet table. And let's also not forget that Gallant was Washington's favorite war criminal, who was also seen as representing U.S. interests within the Israeli government. And so that voice is missing as well. And I think we can also look at Yalon speaking in effect as a surrogate for Israel's military and security establishment against the policies of the Israeli government. You know, not in terms of we shouldn't be doing war crimes, but rather to what end are we implementing these war crimes and crimes against humanity? Is our purpose to reach an agreement with which we can retrieve our captives and thereby help regain some of the lost trust and confidence of the Israeli citizen, of the Israeli soldier, in the commitment of the Israeli security establishment to their welfare and security? Or is the army now become a plaything of the Israeli extreme right, carrying out kind of their pipe dreams of a greater Israel in the face of growing international opposition? So those two factors, I think, provide a fairly good explanation of why Ya'alon spoke, why he spoke now, and what he said.
Yeah, I think to the second part of your answer, I think it's really important to consider because the question which every general, even an Israeli general who has, as you said, question marks about his morality, to what end is this genocide, serving? What is this genocide serving? Is Israel going to be safer? And and it seems like if the Israeli far right had its way, it would lock Israel and its army for another 100 years of ethnic cleansing and war with Palestinians and its neighbors.
And not only,
Um,
yes, and not only Palestinians. Yeah.
yeah, so so there is a lot of discussion around what is all this for. If there isn't peace for Israel at the end of all this, then what is the purpose of a genocide? And there's questions being asked within Israeli media as well. I mean, last week there were reports from an Israeli news agency saying that the redevelopment of Gaza, reconstruction of Gaza, at a very minimal standard, would be something like 100 to 200 billion, which is 575% to 1,150% of the entire Palestinian economy. So, of course, the Palestinians would not be able to do that. And as far as I know, under international law, the occupying power, which in this case is Israel, has the obligation to see that Gaza is rebuilt. That's, of course, Israel is not going to accept that interpretation of international law, but Gaza is an occupying power, and Israel has annihilated Gaza, and therefore it has a duty and obligation to do that. But ultimately, though, what is the end game for Gaza? I mean, your friend Norman Finkelstein, I've heard him a number of times over the past week. He says there is no Gaza. The genocide has been executed thoroughly. There is no chance of ever Gaza being rebuilt, Palestinians returning to their homes, and Gazans will be squeezed more and more into the south. Israel will reclaim the north. And ideally, for the Israelis, if they can, through the Abraham Accords, push the Palestinians out and rehouse them in other parts of the world, that would be the dream scenario for the Israeli. I don't want to say the Israeli far right, most of the Israelis, I would say. So where do you see all this heading then?
Well, the U.S. armed and supplied Israeli military. The U.S. the U.S. supported Israeli government has certainly been doing everything within its power, everything humanly possible, to prove Norman Finkelstein right. His point that Israel's overall strategic objective in this war is to erase the Gaza Strip from the map, to make it unfit for, to make it permanently unfit for human habitation, and to arrive at a situation in which there are effectively no Palestinians left in the Gaza Strip. I'm not sure I would, at this point, already go that far for two reasons. The first is that already now more than a year into Israel's genocidal campaign, while we have voluminous evidence that, unprecedented evidence, the Gaza Strip is not fit for human habitation, none of the neighboring Arab countries have been prepared to do Israel's dirty work and basically accept an Israeli forced displacement of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip into their own territory. And the second point is that I would also argue that one should never underestimate the resourcefulness of the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip. I mean, these are people who, during 17 years of blockade, managed to make cars operate on used vegetable oil and a whole um, uh, plethora of other innovations. And so, you know, if Israel is compelled to end its genocidal onslaught on the Gaza Strip, and particularly if any such end also includes relief for the Gaza Strip in terms of a lifting of the blockade and the entry of desperately needed items to sustain life and to enable reconstruction. My suspicion is that the Gaza Strip, or at least significant parts of it, may well be rebuilt far faster than either these estimates that you've just mentioned or others that have been produced by the World Bank and other organizations have suggested. But again, you know, these are questions that are now, I think, very much speculative, very much theoretical, because we have no indication that even under American pressure or insufficient American pressure, that Israel is prepared to either call a formal halt to its military campaign in the Gaza Strip, or even more importantly, to lift the siege of the Gaza Strip and the pre-existing blockade in line with its international obligations, to say nothing of the international obligations that you mentioned yourself. I suspect the situation Israel would like to see in the Gaza Strip is one similar to the West Bank, where on the one hand, there is no formal agreement, while at the same time it retains the freedom of action to go in and do whatever it wants, whenever it wants, wherever it wants. That may be a much more difficult situation for Israel to achieve in the Gaza Strip, but I suspect that is where they would like to be heading.
Yeah, let's turn our attention to a theme we spoke about last week, the apartheid in the West Bank, and of course, Gaza's way beyond apartheid. There's a genocide taking place there. Last week we spoke about the Israeli Knesset passing it, the defense minister, I think, or security minister, I can't remember who it was, saying that that administrative detention for Palestinians, for
It was
Israeli
the defense
settlers,
minister.
yeah, defense minister, that's right, administrative detention for illegal Jewish settlers in the West Bank will no longer be applied, whereas it will continue to apply on the Palestinians. So again, another indication of the apartheid rules that are operating within the occupied West Bank. And this week, there is another bill that's passing through the Knesset, which will make it more and more difficult for Palestinian citizens of Israel from running municipal elections. That's an ongoing saga. There's always obstacles and hurdles and thresholds which Palestinians have to meet before they can take part in the Knesset elections, now also within municipal elections. At the same time, this Sunday, this show will be coming out on Tuesday, but on Sunday, just 3 days ago, Ben Gvir, he ordered the police to ban all mosques from playing the adhan, which is the Muslim call for prayer. So again, another indication of how they are Israel that is confidently passing apartheid bills, apartheid rules, and enforcing apartheid. In this case, discriminatory laws. Can you tell us a bit about the bill itself that is
Right.
currently going through the
Right.
Knesset, which will make it more and more difficult for Palestinians to run municipal elections?
Yes, I mean, on the one hand, Israel's apologists and flunkies insist that, there is no apartheid, certainly not against Israel's Palestinian citizens. And in fact, Israel's Palestinian citizens enjoy more rights than in any of the surrounding Arab states. Well, this is proof once again that Israel's Palestinian citizens are subject to formal levels of racial discrimination and apartheid. I mean, it goes back all the way to the founding of Israel as a Jewish state, an Israeli state, which in fact does not recognize an Israeli nationality. I mean, it would be similar to Great Britain not recognizing a British nationality, but only an English nationality, in which uh, Welsh and Scottish nationalities were somehow defined as as lesser beings. But what we're dealing with here
So on that,
are
I just want to add a formulation which anti-Zionist Jew mentioned. He has a really nice formula to really expose the racism that's at play here. He will say Japan is for the Japanese, France is for the French, Britain is for the British, but Israel is for the Israelis. It breaks down. Israel is not for the Israelis.
yeah,
Israel is for the Jews. So
yes, yeah.
so that formula doesn't really work when it comes to Israel. Israel is
No,
not for the
because
Israelis.
yes,
Sorry.
you can be a Jewish citizen of the United States or Russia or Japan or any of these other states you just mentioned, and in fact have more rights in Israel simply because of your identity than a Palestinian Muslim or Palestinian Christian or Palestinian Druze um, who is a citizen of the state of Israel and has was born there and has lived there their entire life. But getting back to your question, what we're dealing with here is two legislative initiatives that are currently being pushed through Israel's parliament. And I think it's a fair assumption that at least one, and probably both of them, will in the end be ratified as law in Israel. The first one seeks to find a mechanism to depose sitting members of municipal councils in Israel by making the very vague crime, if you will, of expressing support for armed action against Israel by any of its enemies a legitimate cause for removal from office. And there are a few conditions over how this is supposed to be conducted. But those behind this law are quite clear about what their intention is, and it's to remove Arab officials, as they put it, from municipal councils, because, again, another aspect of the Israeli state and its apartheid is that it views those uh, Palestinians who it was unable to expel along with the overwhelming majority of other Palestinians in 1948 and who remained and became citizens, it views them as a fifth column. More importantly, it views them and says so explicitly as a demographic threat. So imagine, that in Great Britain, the Welsh or the Scots were viewed as a demographic threat to the survival of the British state. And it's seeking to systematically reduce their political power and political representation. The other piece of legislation concerns the ability to to participate in national parliamentary elections. And here it's quite interesting because here you have, again, a piece of legislation that is being promoted by a member of the ruling Likud party. This did not originate with the far right, or rather the most far right elements of the Israeli political spectrum. And the idea is to broaden the criteria under which candidates for parliamentary elections can be disqualified. And it uses, again, vague formulas similar to that other piece we just discussed. And I suspect that if it's passed, a Palestinian citizen of Israel who's seeking parliamentary office and speaks out openly against the genocide or makes the accurate claim that Hamas has accepted the terms of a ceasefire while Israel rejects it, could easily be disqualified under that piece of legislation. And it's so, again, explicitly, according to those who support this bill, its purpose is to restrict and reduce Palestinian participation and representation in Israeli parliamentary politics and national politics. Now, what's interesting here is that there's another element of this legislation which seeks to reduce the role of the Israeli judiciary in assessing such attempts to disqualify Palestinian candidates. And so here we also have to place it in the framework of Netanyahu government's legislative agenda to weaken the judiciary and to place judicial power increasingly in the hands of the political leadership. So you essentially have the solid Israeli consensus on apartheid, the Israeli political consensus on institutional political racism against its Palestinian citizens being used as a battering ram to not only further discriminate against the Palestinian citizens, but also to achieve broader objectives, in this case, further reducing the authority and independence of the Israeli judiciary. If I can just make one point, what's particularly ironic here is that in the early 1980s, there was, in fact, a ban also on a Jewish political party in Israel, Kach, the party led by Meir Kahane, who was disqualified from participating in elections on the basis of his very explicit supremacist racism and so on. But at that time, the main factor driving Yitzhak Shamir's government in disqualifying Kach was that they were worried that it would take votes away from the then dominant Likud party. Well, they've now become bosom buddies. The Jewish Power Movement, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, is a valued member of Israel's ruling coalition. He is, as is commonly known, the political heir of Meir Kahane, and today sits at the very summit of Israeli politics as Israel's national security minister. So what clear evidence do you need that in Israel there is one law for the dominant community and a very different law for the subordinated minorities?
I think that's a really important point that the Kach party, which and its affiliates, which even under US view was a terrorist organization, they're now normalized in the US, Israel, so much that they no longer need to exist as an independent party. I think the main Likud party and also the coalition that's there, they more or less represent the views of the Kach party, Meir Rabbi Meir
Kahane, not Rabbani.
Kahane, sorry, Meir Kahane. So Meir Kahane has become mainstream in Israel. So it's quite a amazing journey, but it's a journey which I think not just critics but supporters of Israel have to recognize. Here you have one individual who played a historic role during the 80s and early 90s. He was deemed as almost an extremist and a terrorist. His policies is now mainstream in Israel. So those who support Israel need to ask themselves, what kind of Israel are you supporting? Let's move on to another story from last week. We spoke about that during a number of shows. First is the former chief prosecutor of the ICC, Fatah Bensouda, coming out and really explaining that how she was mistreated, how there was an attempt to threaten her, undermine her, a campaign, a thug style tactic used to undermine her. And that comes within the context of the broader response to the ICC after it issued a response against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister. We spoke about that last week, but we didn't really see the response that was coming from France and Germany and the UK. France seems to have got off at a really, had a really good start. From what I recall, Macron said that they would respect the judgment of the ICC and arrest Netanyahu if he was to come to France. Now France has found a way around that and offered immunity to Benjamin Netanyahu. And the UK is also now looking to provide similar kind of immunity to Netanyahu, and other Western countries, Germany being another, who's looking to offer immunity to Israel from any kind of arrest. So, just your thoughts on the response from those countries, by those countries, sorry, on the ICC response, how they started off in one position, now quickly they almost done a U-turn to justify offering Netanyahu immunity.
Well, I think the technical description is white man speaks with forked tongue. It's really quite incredible, that the same governments that were besides themselves with praise for the International Criminal Court just a little over a year ago, when it issued an arrest warrant for the Russian leader, President Vladimir Putin, have now all of a sudden come to a very different conclusion, that the ICC is not professional, that it does not have jurisdiction over non-member states, that it has no right to act in the way it did, and that being a head of government, Benjamin Netanyahu, rather than being an international fugitive from justice and a wanted man, in fact enjoys immunity to do as he pleases, whether in the Gaza Strip or in any number of European states. And the United States has gone, which of course also rejects the International Criminal Court, has gone one further and invited the deposed defense minister and also the wanted international fugitive Yoav Gallant to visit Washington. And this is kind of a very clear, calculated, deliberate, premeditated snub at not only the international community and the ICC, but at the very concept of international law and international justice. There's a well-known statement by early 20th century Peruvian military strongman whose name escapes me for the moment. And in his words, for my friends, everything; for my enemies, the law. And that is exactly what we're seeing here. We have, on the one hand, the rules-based international order in which Israel's impunity is a sacred principle, but the laws are strictly applied and enforced on others, versus international law, the international system, the norms and values and principles and institutions which underpin it and which are embraced by the international community as a whole. Now, as you've pointed out, a growing number of European governments, and I think European governments are particularly interesting in this context because, unlike the United States, they are actually members of the International Criminal Court and are under a treaty obligation to comply with its rulings, have increasingly discovered that, in fact, the situation is a little more complex than it appears. What I found particularly humorous was the response of the German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, who said that, in fact, Germany would need to conduct a careful study to determine what an ICC arrest warrant actually means, as if you need a committee of experienced legal professionals to examine the actual meaning of an ICC arrest warrant, because without such a study, no one could possibly figure out what that actually means and what, if any, obligations it would place on on the German state should either of these international fugitives land on German soil. And someone, I can't remember who, pointed out that there was a headline in one of the German newspapers saying, well, Germany can't arrest these Israeli fugitives because of its Nazi past, and that perhaps that was an unintended Freudian slip. But again, you have now also the host country of the ICC, the Netherlands, whose prime minister, in an absolutely bizarre declaration, stated that there could be circumstances under which Netanyahu could visit the Netherlands and be a guest on Dutch soil without triggering the host country's treaty obligations, and without it being obliged to comply with the arrest warrant. So, all of a sudden, ICC means nothing, international law means nothing, ICC arrest warrants mean nothing, and we can go about our merry way as if war crimes and crime against humanity are the most common forms of international conduct. Just as a final point, as you mentioned, I found the French response particularly interesting for the following reasons. As you said, France's initial response was that France is a member state of the ICC and would treat these arrest warrants similar to any others. In other words, that France has a duty to execute them if indicted suspects or fugitives land on French soil. Then all of a sudden, France began to change its tune and put out this very wishy-washy statement of, maybe we will, maybe we won't. It really depends on this, that, and the other. And the context of that was the agreement to cease hostilities between Israel and Lebanon. Um, Netanyahu demanded that the French government publicly distance itself from its ICC treaty obligations in order to play a role in this monitoring committee that was set up under that agreement. And true to form, Netanyahu's demands were then amplified by US President Joe Biden, who called the French president, Emmanuel Macron, and emphasized to him that, in Biden's view, Netanyahu was raising an entirely legitimate point. Macron willfully, happily folded and issued this kind of vague statement that seemed to do enough for Netanyahu. But this raises, I think, the broader question. If this was achieved by Israel in the context of the Lebanon agreement, how much more impunity and immunity will Israel demand and will Israel receive in the context of an eventual agreement to end the genocidal campaign against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip? I think that's a question we need to be asking ourselves. And as a final point, yes, this is all about Israel and the centrality of Israeli impunity to the foreign policies of many Western states. Not all of them. You have Ireland, you have Belgium, you have Norway, who have made very clear that they will comply with their explicit obligations under the Rome Statute and towards the ICC. But for many of these countries, Israeli impunity is central, but there's also more to it. That Israel is for them a convenient battering ram to dismantle international law, to dismantle the laws of war, to dismantle the international institutions that serve as guardians of these laws, that are the custodians of these norms and values. So, once again, Palestine is a canary in the coal mine, and I don't think we should lose sight of that.
Yeah, and the French justification, I mean, that left me scratching my head. I think they said something like, because Israel is not a signatory to the ICC, therefore we can give immunity to Netanyahu. If that's the case, then that also applies to Putin because he's also not a signatory to the ICC. So, yeah, it's very strange. I mean, you'd assume that such issues would not be subject to this kind of bartering or trading.
Mm.
But yeah,
Yeah.
there we are.
Could I
Um,
just clarify something on that one point?
sure.
It's correct that Israel is not a member of the International Criminal Court. It rejects the Rome Statute. It rejects the very existence of the court. It has repeatedly denounced the court as an anti-Semitic conspiracy, and all the rest of these meaningless polemics. And in fact, the irony here is that Israel was involved in drafting the Rome Statute during the 1990s, because the Rome Statute was also uh, seen as kind of an extension of the international community's ongoing response to the German Holocaust and ensuring that such crimes are never committed again with impunity. But when, at the urging of the majority of its members, the ICC's Assembly of State Parties incorporated apartheid and incorporated illegal population transfers into occupied territories as crimes under the Rome Statute, then all of a sudden the ICC became an anti Semitic conspiracy and an extension of the Nazis rather than an institution meant to prevent their repetition. But the point I wanted to make is that, yes, Israel is not an ICC member, but the state of Palestine is and has been properly admitted to the ICC, and therefore, whether or not Israel is a member state or subscribes to the Rome Statute is entirely irrelevant, because any crime committed by any national of a of an ICC member state, or by the national of any state on the territory of an ICC member state, falls under ICC jurisdiction. And it's because of that that the ICC has been able to issue arrest warrants against not only Israelis, but also Palestinians. And compare it to the situation in Ukraine. In Ukraine, neither Russia nor Ukraine are ICC members. And in fact, Ukraine submitted a declaration to the ICC that it would accept ICC jurisdiction with respect to the Russian invasion of its territory. So it's a much more restricted form of jurisdiction than in this case. I don't hear anyone complaining about that.
Exactly. Before we move to our last question on developments in Syria, which I guess no one would have predicted last week, I just wanted to get your thoughts on the ceasefire agreement between Hezbollah and Israel. Ben Gvir, he's come out and said that Israel failed to achieve its war aims. And just this morning, I think it was the Jerusalem Post, they had an article saying that Israel is already violating the terms of the ceasefire, and that's a comment from U.S. Special Envoy Amos Hochstein. So just get your thoughts and update on the ceasefire and the fact that Israel's already violating it.
Hmm. Well, when you have the French, who again bought their way into this monitoring committee essentially by repudiating the International Criminal Court, when you have the French stating that Israel has already committed dozens of violations of this agreement, and now you have none other than Amos Hochstein, who is a former Israeli soldier, who is also an American citizen and serves as the uh, bizarrely enough, as the American envoy for this Israeli-Lebanese agreement. When you have him now stating that Israel is violating the agreement, I mean, what more needs to be said? You know, no analysis or investigation is necessary. Um, Israel's own man in Washington and Washington's own man in Israel is saying it and putting it out as clear as daylight. And it reflects, you know, the problem here is that we have two agreements. First, we have an Israeli Lebanese agreement mediated by the United States, which obligates both Israel and Lebanon. And then there's also a secret, undisclosed, unpublished Israeli-American side agreement, which doesn't, which to which Lebanon is not a party and which imposes absolutely no obligations on Lebanon. And this side agreement, from what's been reported about it, again, reported rather than officially confirmed, effectively appoints Israel as the arbiter of respect for a ceasefire agreement that Israel is a party to, and appoints Israel as a chief enforcer of an agreement that it's supposed to be a party to. So Israel, in American eyes, is complying with its ceasefire obligations by conducting attacks on Lebanese soil. And you know, I from the outset felt that this was a very fragile agreement that's unlikely to see out the new year. We're now speaking on Monday, December 2nd, and just before we began our conversation, there are reports that, you know, after these dozens of Israeli violations, Hezbollah has now decided that it too is going to take active measures to enforce compliance by the other side with the ceasefire agreement, and has apparently fired a number of shells or rockets at the occupied Shab'a farm. So we may well be seeing the rather rapid disintegration of this agreement, or we may be seeing now a more serious effort to put it back on track. The coming days will tell.
Well, let's end with developments in Syria. And as I said, I don't think anyone would have predicted what we saw over the past couple of days as anti-Assad forces took over large swathes of the northwestern territory of Syria. And I've been following explanations of that. And to me, I mean, it can be more or less broken down into three perspectives. One is that this is viewed through the lens of CIA funding anti-Assad forces to make it costly for Putin. And their focus is Putin, to make it costly for Putin to execute his war in Ukraine, and also at the same time holding on to Syria. There's another explanation, which is that this is part of a US-Israel drive in their next stage to isolate Hezbollah from Iran. And there's a third explanation, which is simply these are, of course, victims of Bashar al-Assad's aggressive war, war of aggression, and an opportunity. And they see an opportunity now to again overthrow the dictator, and are taking advantage of the fact that Russia is stretched militarily, Hezbollah is weakened, and Iran is also weakened, and they want to take advantage of that. So most commentators kind of fall into one of those three lenses. I mean, where do you put yourself? Maybe there is another explanation, and what is the main thing about this massive development in the Middle East that we should be considering?
Well, in my defense, although I didn't see these developments coming, I did point out several weeks ago, as Israel unleashed its full-scale assault on Lebanon, that not only was it likely to expand further regionally, but that the conflict may well extend to Syria. What we've seen now is the Syrian kaleidoscope has been turned yet again. And I think there are two background factors to take into account here. The first is the long running stalemate between Syrian military, the Syrian government on the one hand, and the Syrian armed opposition on the other. The front lines have effectively been frozen for at least half a decade in a situation where neither party appears to have had the wherewithal to deal a knockout blow to the other. A second element is that as most Gulf Cooperation Council states, with the notable exception of Qatar, have normalized relations with the Syrian government, Turkey's leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has attempted to reach some kind of agreement with Damascus as well, primarily seeking to secure Turkey's role in northern Syria. Although both of Syria's chief international allies, Iran and Russia, encouraged the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad to respond to the Turkish outreach. Assad categorically refused to have such a meeting on the grounds that this is an issue of Syrian sovereignty, and Turkey has absolutely no business discussing the future of any part of Syria with the Syrian government. And the third and more recent and arguably decisive factor here are indeed, as you mentioned, the regional and international changes. You have, on the one hand, the continuation of US and European sanctions on Syria, which have prevented the Syrian government from providing, let's say, an economic dividend to its population as a conflict, as let's say the primarily armed phase of the conflict largely came to an end several years ago. And so the economic crisis within Syria continued to deepen. Next, you have Russia, which has been intervening in Syria since 2015, being increasingly preoccupied with the war in Ukraine. And then you have, more recently, of course, these very severe blows Israel administered to Hezbollah, and also the perception of a weakened regional role for Iran. That, we've seen all these reports that this is somehow an offensive by Syrian opposition, coordinated between Israel, the United States, and Turkey. Without direct evidence of that, I would at this stage go no further than to say the Syrian armed opposition, actively encouraged by Turkey, smelled an opportunity created for it by Israeli and US policy, and decided to strike while the opportunity presented itself. Because, of course, for Israel, a main objective is to remove Syria as the primary conduit for the delivery of weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the rearmament of Hezbollah is a primary uh, Israeli objective. And for the United States and the Europeans, I think their objective, as it has been for many years, is to keep the Syrian government weak, embattled, but in power. what better adversary than one that is too weak to stand on its own feet? And for Turkey, of course, its primary objective is seeking to eliminate the zones of Kurdish autonomy in northern Syria, particularly in the enclaves west of the Euphrates River. So the Syrian kaleidoscope has been turned. We had these very dramatic offensives. In fact, two parallel offensives. The first by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, commonly now referred to as the former affiliate of Al-Qaeda in Syria, which launched its primary offensives against Syria's second largest city, Aleppo, and is now attempting to move further south towards Hama and Homs. And then you have a second offensive being waged by what many would say is the misnamed Syrian National Army, which is effectively a Turkish proxy, and who are directing their main efforts against the Kurdish autonomous forces in northern Syria. Now, the question becomes is given this collapse of the Syrian military, will it be able to remobilize? Will its allies in Russia, in Iran, and Hezbollah, potentially in Iraq, be able to mobilize sufficient strength with sufficient rapidity to arrest and potentially reverse this offensive? And if they don't, or if they can't, and particularly if they can't because of external intervention that prevents them from doing so, what consequences will this have on the actual situation in Syria? Again, my suspicion is that certainly the Western powers would like to see the Syrian government further weakened, but not necessarily replaced at this stage. As far as Israel's agenda, it's anyone's guess, but I think they're looking at this opportunity to place further pressure on Lebanon and Hezbollah and on Iran's regional coalition as at least for now, a very, very welcome development. And of course, ultimately, what does this mean for the Syrian people, who ultimately is what this is all about? Will this produce even more suffering for this people who has already suffered enormously over the course of a decade and a half? Or will perhaps at this stage Syria's international allies be able to prevail upon Damascus to reach some kind of agreement with the opposition to reach some kind of accommodation and greater stability within the country? That to me seems unlikely, particularly because I think the Turks are now probably also not too keen on such a development.
I'm sure we'll be returning to this topic, not least because from what I see, risk splitting the pro-Palestinian camp. There's a lot of mixed emotions with this, and
Certainly.
we'll discuss this in more length in our upcoming shows, no doubt. So, as usual, Moina, thank you so much for joining
Thank
us,
you.
and thank you also for tuning in for this week's weekly review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Bye-bye.